Today's event was to celebrate the life and legacy of lawman Bass Reeves. We have an exhibit here at the Three Rivers Museum. Our point today was to bring people together to learn a little bit more about this man. The eulogy was actually what was printed in the Muskogee Phoenix. It was the longest eulogy for a person of color in this town. That was 1910.
Bass Reeves is quite possibly the greatest frontier hero in United States history. He was a former slave who couldn't read or write. And when he became a deputy U.S. Marshal in 1875, he began memorizing his warrants that he'd have to handle. And so he would have somebody read the warrant off to him, and he would remember the name and what the crime was for. And he would carry out as many as 30 warrants at a time. And in his 32 years, never did he bring in the wrong person because he was illiterate. He had almost total recall in terms of his memory. Actually, due to the fact that Bass was an escaped slave from Texas, he hid out in Indian Territory, and he learned the languages and the culture himself and could speak to the Native Americans.
Bass Reeves, at least by the account of the United States Marshal's Museum, was the most exemplary law enforcement officer the country has ever seen. Growing up as a child of slavery, going into literally stealing his own freedom, becoming a law enforcement officer as a black man in the South is just, all of that is something that is very easily turned into folklore. But when you look at the numbers, the provable events, the things that he did as a deputy going through his life, it really becomes apparent how special he was as a person and how capable he was as a law enforcement officer. About 2,000 objects in our collection between what's here on the shelves, what I'm processing in. This particular pair of objects was donated to us by Paul Brady, federal court judge in Atlanta and the one verified descendant of Bass Reeves. This particular gun was owned by Bass Reeves. I can't guarantee that he carried this while he was a marshal. The 1870s, 80s, 90s, it really was literally the Wild West. A lot of what people understand and think about the history of the American West is based in stories that came out of Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory.
The Indian Territory was originally set aside for the 5 civilized tribes, as they were called, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. When the Civil War came about, due to the fact that some of those tribes fought for the South, the United States took away half of their land, which is pretty much the whole state of Oklahoma. So the eastern portion of Oklahoma then became the sovereign nations of the 5 civilized tribes. And they had their own governments, they had their own police, their own judges, their own courts, and they could adjudicate cases for their citizens. But they could not arrest or adjudicate people who were not citizens of their nations. The federal government had a court at Fort Smith. That court had jurisdiction over all the Indian Territory for Native Americans who committed crimes against non-citizens and non-citizens who committed crimes against Native Americans. They would travel all the way west to Fort Sill, then they would go north to Fort Reno, also sometime as far north as Fort Supply. Then they would come all the way back to Fort Smith, Arkansas. It could be up to a 2-month trip sometime to round up outlaws and bring them back to Fort Smith.
So this is the first jail of the Fort Smith Federal Court for the Western District of Arkansas. When the federal court takes over in 1872, the Army moves out, they convert this space into a jail to support the federal court, which was right upstairs. The person would have committed or allegedly committed the crime in Indian Territory. As long as they were not a tribal member, would come back here. The federal court would issue a warrant for arrest or a subpoena for the U.S. Marshals. They would give that to the Marshals. The Marshal would give that to one of his deputies, and then the deputy would go into Indian Territory to track down, investigate, eventually hoping to arrest the criminal and bring them back to Fort Smith.
During Bass's life, being a black man in the South during the time, especially following the American Civil War, he was facing racism on a daily basis. As a law enforcement officer in an area, really the only area in the country that would allow a black man to arrest anyone. Other parts of the country, black law enforcement officers were hired to patrol black areas of the community. Fort Smith was really about the only place in the country where a black man could arrest a white man and not have anything come back on them publicly.
There was no segregation for the most part during the Indian territorial era. There were people pushing for segregation, Jim Crow laws. They could not be supported until statehood in 1907. There was not much need for deputy U.S. marshals at statehood, and so they became county policemen or city policemen. And Bass was given a job in Muskogee, but he used to like to brag about the fact that there was never a crime committed on his beat.
Here's the headstone that his grandnephew from Atlanta was able to get donated. Rather than to have nothing, you could come and learn about it. So this was a good move.
He was a phenomenon of that time. I tell people he's like the Michael Jordan of the Wild West. A lot of accomplishments and things that African Americans did in the United States was marginalized. And one of the things that really needs to be researched more is the African American participation on the Western frontier, be they soldiers, entrepreneurs, scouts, cowboys. I think it's incumbent upon people in the country to know the history of everyone, be they descendants of Europeans, African Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans. The more you know of an ethnic group in the country, you tend to respect them as people more. Everybody's history can be celebrated and appreciated, and it's all part of the United States of America. Bass Reeves was a great, great American hero.